The clatter of plates, the hush of linen against wood, the soft chime when the swing door opened. These were the rhythms Anna had learned to count her days by. She moved through the dining room with the practiced economy of someone who kept secrets in her pockets. A tray balanced at waist level, a smile measured to the grain of wood and the angle of eyes. Hands that knew how to steady a wine glass and how to fold a napkin so no crease betrayed haste. Outside, the city was a lattice of glass and light. Inside, the restaurant held its own constellations in the chandeliers. For the guests, she was the dependable constant, attentive, invisible in the ways that mattered, and utterly unremarked upon. She liked that invisibility most days. It let her survive. She had once been dangerous in a way that made headlines and led to patent filings and speeches at conferences. Now, her most audacious act was translating an order from a Russian tour group without missing a step. She had learned to keep the edges of her other life dull, like a blade sanded smooth until it fit comfortably into a drawer. But on quiet nights, when the dishwashers hummed and the restaurant's dim light flattered everything to forgiving shapes, those edges pricked her. The old code comments that spelled out a better algorithm, a colored notebook margin where a variable name held a cadence like a memory, the signature of a design no longer under her name. Tonight, a television over the bar threw a bright rectangle across the far wall, and an advertisement broke through the hum of conversation. The camera swooped across a marble logo, Lexicana, the company that had once been a joint project and then a courtroom specter. The ad was sleek, glass towers, smiling developers, a narrator with a voice the sound editors had polished until it lured trust. "If you translate this in 10 minutes, you win $1 million, the announcer said, and the challenge flashed on screen. A block of text in a rare dialect, a countdown timer, a promise wrapped in a brand. The dining room laughed, light amusement at a corporate stunt, but Anna's hands went still. There was a bitter humor to the line. They had always loved a spectacle. If this story keeps you with me, please subscribe, like, and stay for the whole tale. She watched the clip twice while pouring water for a table near the window. The phrase had the cadence of something engineered, a viral hook built from market research, timed to maximize humiliation and shareability. Lexicana's challenge wasn't an innocent test of skill. It was theater designed around the public domination of the unknown. Anna felt the old familiar speed in her chest. Calm decision, rapid calculation. She could translate that dialect. She had trained software to do precisely that in a version of Lexicana's alpha. She could see, in an instant, the fingerprint, the way the translation smoothed rare idioms into approximations that only her model would make. The particular ordering of clauses the algorithm favored when facing ambiguous morphemes. She set the tray down and moved back to the pass, cleaning a plate with a practiced circular motion while the television burbled on. She told herself to keep quiet. Her present life was safety wrapped in small tasks. But the challenge burrowed like a splinter. A half hour later, a server ran a tablet through the dining room, the ad center frame, and a table of undergraduate interns jeered at the idea of anyone from outside elite circles winning such a prize. "They'll never let a nobody get that far," one of them said. And the word nobody landed on Anna like an accusation. She told herself she wouldn't answer when the camera asked for volunteers. She told herself she could walk past a microphone like she walked past the television. Then, when a woman at the far end of the room, an older guest with a soft laugh and a neat scarf, spilled half her wine and sent the servers into a flutter, Anna stepped in without thinking. She translated the woman's apology into Spanish so quick the patron blinked, surprised at the crispness. The older woman smiled at her with the exact tenderness that had once been reserved for a different kind of brilliance. "You speak 3 languages," the woman said, and Anna nodded. "You should try the contest," she added, bright as if handing out fortune cookies. Anna had an instinctive mistrust of luck, but the woman's eyes held a look that was not curiosity, but a recognition she hadn't earned. "I don't do contests," Anna said. Her voice was small in the room. The woman's smile widened. "Why not? You might win $1 million." The laugh across the table this time carried less mocking humor and more certainty. The younger diners raised their drinks. A woman at the bar turned toward the screen, then looked back at Anna, amused. "You'd be a walk, no, a sprint to the bank," the hostess whispered as she passed. "Imagine what $1 million does." They laughed at her in that easy, casual way that people laugh at curiosities, at a waitress stepping, almost whimsically, into a spotlight designed for other kinds of people. Anna felt the hot shame of being visible. She thought of the signature now missing from her old files, of the pseudonym she adopted, of rent notices and the arc of nights spent polishing flatware until her fingers ached. She thought of David, of his smile in the press release where he announced a new era, of a press photo where the hand that should have been hers rested confidently on the company's glossy brochure. She laughed too, the sound measured so as not to be too loud, and turned away. The woman, whose name tag read Evelyn Blackwood, caught Anna's wrist as she passed, with a light touch. Only a brush, but a chop of heat went through Anna's palm. "Don't let them laugh at you," Evelyn said, private and immediate. "You've got something people pay for." Her thumb brushed Anna's knuckle in a way that felt more like a promise than an offer. "Meet me after your shift. My friend here, someone who sees things, wants to talk to you." Anna's first instinct was to decline. Her second instinct, the one that had taken her through courtrooms and patent offices, was to assess the risk. Evelyn Blackwood's scarf had a discreet crest. Private philanthropy, Anna guessed, not the brand of celebrities, but people who moved in rooms where decisions were made. The look in Evelyn's eyes was not fame-seeking curiosity. It was careful. That mattered. By the time Anna finished the last table, the dining room had rotated through courses and conversation. The bar was quieter now. The television had moved on to sports. Evelyn waited by the hostess stand, a small, deliberate figure, and beside her stood a man whose presence cleared the air. He wore a coat that cost more than Anna's monthly rent, but not the ostentation of wealth. It was a rearrangement of the world around him, someone who could make elevators run faster, doors open, and people listen. Anna had the economy of movement down to a practiced rhythm, a tray, a nod, eyes down so that no one could read what she truly thought. The man lifted his head when she approached, and the restaurant's lights found his cheekbones. He smiled in a way that was formal enough to be polite, but uncertain enough to be curious. "Anna," Evelyn said, "this is Marcus Blackwood. Marcus, this is, well, Anna helps me out tonight." Marcus extended his hand. His fingers were cool. "I saw you on the television," he said. "You had a look when the ad played. It's the look of someone who knows more than they let on." Anna closed her fingers around his in a way that acknowledged the contact, but did not give anything away. "I know how to keep things moving," she said. It was a pared-down truth that made him laugh, a small sound of agreement rather than amusement. "Would you mind sitting for a minute?" Evelyn asked. "I'm hosting a small talk tomorrow at my office. I think you should meet some people." Anna could refuse. She could keep the apron on and the day compartmentalized, the present job sealed from the past like a photograph hidden between pages. She almost did. Then she felt the old urge to test a problem, to see if a key still fit a lock. "If it's just talking," she said. "No cameras, no publicity." Marcus's eyes sharpened. "No publicity unless you want it," he said. "I don't do theater." There was something in that sentence, an unadvertised rule. It suggested an intelligence that operated by different measures than public applause. Anna had been ambushed by public ritual before. She had also learned to recognize the value of discretion. She accepted. They met the next afternoon in a conference room on the 24th floor of a building that seemed to hang like a polished coin over the river. The space smelt faintly of lemon polish and new upholstery. Sunlight struck the windows in a way that made everything seem either transparent or judged. Marcus's office was functional rather than flashy. Books, a single photograph that showed a younger Marcus with his mother on a yacht, a plant with leaves edged in burnished gold. He was not the sort of man who launched into biography. He watched, and when he spoke, his words were measured to an economy of need. "You've been in the field," he said, "and you stopped. That takes a reason someone like me wants to understand." Anna told him in small, deliberate segments the outlines she had learned to pass along when necessary. She described building language models that could reconcile sparse dialect corpora, the late nights training on servers that fritzed and rebooted, a patent application that had nearly been ready when David took the lead on public relations and the filing slipped into his name. She did not say everything. There were scars that still ached from the court filings and the way colleagues had turned their backs, but she said enough that Marcus could see the architecture. He listened the way someone who had organized companies heard lists, for structural integrity, for fingerprints. He asked one technical question about timestamps. How often did her models commit changes? And Anna answered with the precise cadence of someone who had once ruled over a repository of code. She could feel herself tightening around the old competence, as if muscle memory had been waiting under the habits of the apron. "You didn't sue?" Marcus asked finally. Anna let out a sound that was almost a laugh. "I did," she said, "but I lost more than the case. The evidence had been muddied, papers redated, funding flows obscured. People I trusted turned." She pressed her thumb into the pad of her palm without looking. It was the way she kept herself centered. Marcus's gaze moved to a stack of printed pages on his desk, patent abstracts, a few technical diagrams, the kind of précis that told you less than the person who wrote them meant. His hand tapped the paper once. "I don't believe in public humiliation as a method of vetting skill," he said. "If Lexicona is staging a challenge as advertisement, it's possible they're doing it because they're worried." "Worried about what?" Anna asked. "That someone could show that the work is derived from another source." His voice was low. "Or that their claims are fragile." They spoke in careful increments. Marcus did not offer money as a bandage for old wounds. He offered questions. He wanted to know dates, files, the names attached to the original repository, the people who had been witnesses to Anna's work. When she mentioned a junior developer who had been concise and loyal, he noted the name and said he'd speak with her. When she hesitated over a memory of the day David had announced their split, Marcus reframed it not as a personal betrayal, but as a chain of public acts that left evidence, press releases, domain registrations, filings. "People who build things often leave breadcrumbs," he said. "They're sloppy in the places that matter." Anna felt, oddly, that she could breathe. Not because someone had offered a solution, Marcus wasn't offering one yet, but because someone else had accepted the premise that she had been wronged. There was a small, steady dignity in that. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine the possibility of a different ledger, where her name returned in bold type to the documents she'd once authored. "You understand risks?" Marcus asked. "If I start looking into this..." His eyes met hers. "There will be noise. There will be PR. There may be retaliation." She had expected that, the way a seasoned swimmer expects a tide. She nodded. "I understand." They did not shake hands then. Instead, Marcus placed a business card on the table with a fraction of emotion that looked almost like a bow. On the back was a private number and a short line. For questions, not for headlines. Outside, the city smoked afternoon heat against glass. Inside, the conference room's light fell to secret angles. Anna left with a small packet of photocopies Marcus had insisted she take, a press release with David's signature, a truncated patent filing listing Lexicona as sole owner, a server log snippet that looked innocuous until she recognized the pattern of commits she'd taught an apprentice. Her name was not on them. but the shape of what had existed remained in the pattern, a residual architecture that a sufficiently precise eye could tease into proof. That night, after she locked the restaurant's storeroom and the street emptied to a soft hush, Anna sat on her narrow couch with the papers spread across her knees. She smoothed her thumb over the edge of the patent diagram until the grease of it left a faint smear. She remembered nights in a loft where walls had been whiteboards and people drank too much coffee. She remembered arguments, informational, not violent, about credit and who should speak to investors. David had been the one with the speech, the camera presence that made his charm an asset. He had also been the one who had rewritten the narrative when it suited him. Anna pushed the papers into a folder and slid it beneath the mattress. The old biology of fear rose in her throat, a tightness she'd learned to name and walk through. But beneath it, a different feeling worked like a slow stitch: resolve. The plan would not be a bombastic one-woman crusade. It would be careful. It would be technical. It would matter because evidence mattered. Across town, David watched the same advertisement he'd approved a dozen times, his fingers drumming against a glass of scotch. He liked the laugh the campaign was getting. The social feeds had already started picking apart the challenge. And he liked how the public would assume that Lexicana was generous, a patron of linguistic arts. He had been careful, he told himself, when he had taken the filings into his name. Legal counsel, a few well-placed transfers, a redaction here and there. Anna was a wound he'd kept simple in his mind by consigning her to silence. She'd been the spark, but the narrative belonged to him now. He had built the company, the investors had believed him, and the markets had rewarded the spectacle. He did not account for being noticed in a dining room by a member of the family that held sway in a handful of philanthropic circles. He did not expect someone like Marcus to take a patient interest in a waitress who once wrote code. In the comfortable geometry of his confidence, the world lined up in convenient angles. The first move came quietly. Marcus's legal team sent a discreet request to Lexicana's counsel for the original source materials behind the translation test. They asked for metadata, commit histories, patent draft versions, and the chain of custody for the models in production. The request was framed in careful legalese, polite and formal, the sort of letter that made reputations shiver because it invited scrutiny without declaring war. Lexicana replied with a curated archive, a slick dossier, PDF filings, curated screenshots. It was clean. It was persuasive. It was also, to someone who had once stared at raw repositories until dawn, just enough to set a trap. The metadata the company provided included documents with creation dates that post-dated public announcements, files saved under different usernames, and a cleverly assembled set of hashes that seemed to tie things together. But Marcus's team, led by Charles Morrison, a lawyer whose hair had the gray of someone who had negotiated settlements and lost friends to corporate trench warfare, did not accept the surface. Morrison's team asked for unredacted server logs, timestamps from the build pipeline, and the raw commit history from the development environment. In their request, they included an unspoken question. If Lexicana's files were clean, why the need to hide history? Marcus's eyes were calm when they asked, but there was an edge to his voice that made the committee on the other end feel a small prickle of uncertainty. Pride had a way of making people sloppy. David smiled at the news that Lexicana would dodge the more invasive requests. He believed in the firewall of PR and the moat of legal defense. He had a team that could write letters and fold narratives. He had investors who liked the presentable face he offered and preferred not to disturb it, even if a small, very small risk rippled through the periphery. That risk, in his mind, was manageable. Anna's life continued in increments, a series of small stations. Opening at 6, the half-hour lull when she ate a sandwich alone at the corner table, the steady stream of customers who demanded charisma and precision in equal parts. She found her thoughts coiling around Marcus's question about commute cadence and the way the server logs would show author handles. She called an old colleague, Sarah, on a number she'd kept in a hidden folder, and said little more than a time and a place. Sarah met her under a bridge, eyes wary, hair pulled into a messy knot that made her look perpetually ready to run. They spoke in fragments at first. The smell of ozone in the testing room, the time a data set had been corrupted by a careless analyst, the way David would charm an investor while redirecting the credit. Sarah's memory was a map of tiny technical details, file names, emails signed with a shorthand only insiders used. She produced a handful of screenshots on a battered phone, lines of code with variable names Anna herself had coined, a note from a junior engineer that referenced a late-night merge, a commit that had been attributed to a system account in the company's supplied archive, but that bore a timestamp inconsistent with server logs. "Someone scrubbed it," Sarah said. Her voice was raw at the edges. "They reattributed commits. They staged a repo drop so the public footprint matched their story. But the internal logs? If someone asks the right question, they'll see the difference." Anna felt the shape of the evidence like a cool stone in her palm. It was not vindication yet. No court had written her name back into any document. But it was raw and sensible and carrying the faint iron scent of truth. She folded the screenshots into her folder and felt them like money. Then the harassment started, small, designed to unsettle. Anonymous emails with images of her old codebase, a shadowy mention of "remember who you are," a frozen bank account for a night after a suspicious automated transaction. The threats were not physical, they were procedural, the sort that made credit reports hiccup and landlords ask for extra deposits. Lexicona's social feeds created a swirl of commentary that called their challenge a playful test of skill and hinted that anyone claiming prior authorship was simply a sore loser. The messages were meant to make her retreat. Marcus called the first time she received a late-night email that said simply, "You should be careful." His tone was flat and unblinking when he asked if she was all right. "If they make this personal," he said, "we escalate. Let me handle the channels. You don't have to answer anything you don't want to." She wanted, more than anything, to do this alone. She also understood that alone had been where she had been when the world stole her work first time. She gave him permission to act. Marcus arranged for secure lines, for encrypted storage of their evidence, for a consulting forensic analyst who could extract server logs in ways that were defensible in court. He did not take her by the wrist and drag her into a suit. He offered a steadying presence that asked only for collaboration. She found herself answering his calls, though she did not always like the reminder that someone else's resources now scaffolded her life. It felt like borrowing a ladder to climb out of a pit she had fallen into before. The online challenge rolled into the public imagination with the ridiculous force of a carnival wheel. Pundits debated, weekend hosts joked, and Lexicona's hashtag trended for a day. People submitted translations, some honest, some bought, some fraudulent. At a live event, they set up a stage where contestants could take a kiosk and attempt to translate the text within 10 minutes. Cameras framed the contestants in a way that emphasized vulnerability. Close-ups, crowd shots, music that suggested triumph or embarrassment depending on the outcome. Anna did not plan to enter. She followed from a distance, looking for patterns in the output. She watched as the company highlighted runs that matched their expected output and dismissed those that didn't. There was an odd consistency in the favored translations, a smoothing of culturally specific terms into generic approximations, an ordering of clauses that had made her frown when she taught that to a trainee. It was the same signature she kept seeing in her head, the shape of an algorithm she'd once taught a system to prefer. That signature would be the key. If you could show that two outputs bore the same statistical fingerprint as the algorithm she'd authored, and that algorithm's provenance pointed back to her work, then the public show ceased to be just a spectacle. It became a forensic trail. Marcus's team moved silently and forward. They requested depositions and server images. They contacted the company that hosted Lexicona's build pipeline and asked for a full history of the Docker images and commit hashes. The hosting company, obliging at first with a trimmed response, then became volatile. Lexicona's counsel sent a terse letter implying litigation risk for prying. David's team issued a press statement. Lexicona's intellectual property was original. Anyone suggesting otherwise was engaging in bad faith. Publicity sharpened. Anna's apartment filled with nights where she lay awake and thought of the way the world could turn on a word. She dreamed of screens with code like moss and of signatures that unspooled into numbers and then into jaws of lawyers closing. One morning, a package arrived at her door. A battered manila envelope with no return address. Inside was a small USB drive and nothing else. Her hand stilled at the sight. The drive might be a trap, malware, an attempt to draw her into unlawful possession. Or it might be a piece of evidence someone had risked sending because they believed in her. She turned it over with the care of someone handling a relic. There was no note, only the weight of a choice. She took it to a cafe with fiber internet and an independent security consultant Marcus had recommended. The consultant, a woman named Jen, set a laptop into a sandbox, isolated from any network, and plugged the drive in with clinically gentle fingers. The screen showed a directory with a single archive, a commit log, and a set of raw files. Metadata in the files revealed author names and timestamps. They were older than Lexicona's public claims. There were traces of a username Anna recognized, a handle she had used in the repositories long before David filed his public patents. Anna felt the air change in the cafe. Her palms slicked with the taste of it. "You see it?" Jen asked, voice careful as if not to startle a fragile thing. Anna leaned forward. The commit history showed a gradual build, comments in technical shorthand, test runs, and notes that only someone with intimate knowledge of linguistic edge cases would have left. There was also, embedded in one file, a personal comment in plain text, a line where Anna had once scribbled a note to herself about a trick to normalize idiomatic markers. It was a detail you did not include for theatrics. It was a working note. It was a signature. Jen exhaled. This is material. We need to verify hashes against original builds, and then we push to chain of custody servers. This is the kind of primary evidence a court will value. Anna nodded. The fear in her chest became a new thing. Not only fear, but the steady, crystalline clarity of purpose. She thought of David's press photographs, his voice on a stage claiming credit, and of the way the public had accepted a new narrative because it was easier than interrogating complexity. She thought of Marcus's steady gaze and Evelyn's thumb on her knuckle, a physical punctuation of trust that had not been there before. Outside, a group of spectators chanted at the Lexicona stage as a contestant failed to finish within the 10-minute window. The crowd loved spectacle. It loved winners and losers. Inside a small cafe, a woman who had been laughed at by the world leaned over a screen that showed her life written into code and felt something inside her harden into a plan. She would not only prove the theft, she would reclaim the ledger of the work that had once been hers. David, meanwhile, watched a feed of the event and smiled at the ridicule directed at the contestants. He had not expected a serious challenge to his narrative. His model had been built, in his view, on a foundation of practical choices and charisma. If someone dug up a few lines of code and declared ownership, he would fight the claim as he had before. He would spend money, hire teams, bury bad evidence in procedural quagmires. He had done it once and won. He did not count on Marcus's patience, on a man who stalked truth with the methodical boredom of someone who preferred to outwork uncertainty rather than outshout it. He did not count on a woman in a cafe who had nothing to lose and suddenly everything to reclaim. When the first subpoena came, quiet, precise, unarguable, David's smile faltered for the first time. He called his counsel, his voice thin with surprise that a private party could find such traction so quickly. "We can bury this," he said at one point, not as a strategy, but as an assumption he'd always counted on. His counsel, who had once been fond of rhetorical violence, was careful now. "You can bury truth for a while," the lawyer said, "but subpoenas compel documents. If anyone curated archives in a way that misrepresents authorship, the risk is reputational and legal. We can make moves, but we need a counter-strategy. If this becomes public, we need to manage the narrative." David's careful geometry creaked. He felt, dimly, the faint pest of unease. In conference rooms designed to flatten conflict into spreadsheets, unease was a bad denominator. Anna slept poorly that night. She dreamed of servers as vaults and of hands turning pages, and she woke with her throat tight and the folder of evidence pressed to her chest like an amulet. The world outside continued to clink and chatter, indifferent. Inside, constellations were aligning in small forces. A woman who could speak the language of machines, an ally who could prod the wheels of power, a lawyer who knew how to make courts ask the right questions, and a crowd that loved spectacle enough to be moved by drama when it was undeniable. She thought of the television line that had set the night spiraling. "If you translate this in 10 minutes, you win $1 million. They'd laughed at the waitress. The laugh had been currency, a way to redistribute shame. Anna folded the thought into her pocket like a coin she intended to spend. She was not prepared for the way the public would react when the first leak, small and controlled by Marcus's team to test the water, surfaced. An internal memo from Lexicona that contained a redacted discussion about reattributing commits to a system account. The leak did not accuse, it simply showed an administrative note and a date that contradicted public statements. The social feeds lit up, first with skeptical commentary and then with a slow arc toward outrage. People loved a narrative where David might have misled them. They loved it more when the facts sharpened. David braced himself like a man preparing for a storm and forgot in his calculation the detail of human beings who were not in his tribe. People do not always accept the neat shielding that money provides. They accept with a kind of relief when a wrong is corrected. For Anna, the leak was both vindication and a new lever of fear. Lexicona lashed back with lawyers and with a PR team that transformed inquiry into suggestion, bad actors, competitive attacks, misinformation. The company had resources to manufacture noise. The question was whether their manufactured noise could outweigh clear, verifiable evidence. Marcus's legal team, meanwhile, gathered signatures and hashes, time-stamped files, and sworn affidavits from former colleagues who remembered details they might not have remembered had the story not ripened into a possibility. Sarah provided a chain of custody for the screenshots. Jen, the consultant, authenticated the USB drive. The pieces moved with the fine choreography of people who knew how to build a case that would not crack under cross-examination. Anna watched the slow assembly like an artist watching a sculpture take shape, fragments of material reconfigured into something that resembled the person she had once been. She did not know that David, cornered by procedural precision, would turn ugly in small, corrosive ways. He tried to discredit witnesses, he pushed counterclaims of theft against her, and he sent deniable messages meant to fray the edges of her security. But each of his moves left a trail: emails, recorded conversations, a string of forwarded memos. Marcus's team cataloged them. The rawness of corporate ugliness was a kind of documentary evidence. Malice often left fingerprints more visible than the careful erasure of credit. When the first face-to-face occurred, it was at a deposition room where lights flattened features and cameras recorded everything for future perusal. Anna sat with Marcus at a long table, the two of them smaller in the sterile light than David's polished suit across from them. David's smile was thin. His charm had to work harder in a room where the law cared only about documents. Charles Morrison led the questioning. He was not theatrical. He was precise, a scalpel in a room full of facades. He drew out the commit history, displayed timestamps, and asked David to explain discrepancies. David's answers, rehearsed and composed, began to show the seams. He spoke of council advisories and of corporate governance. He claimed in a brittle voice that any resemblance between Anna's old work and Lexicona's products was coincidence. Morrison produced the USB evidence, the commit history with Anna's handle, the screenshots, the server logs, and the personal note she had once scribbled in a file. He asked David about a particular line in the code that normalized a dialect-specific idiom. David's brow furrowed. He said he did not recall authoring that line. The lawyer asked him to identify who had authored it, and David could not. Under legal pressure, the shaky architecture of David's narrative showed cracks. It was not a cinematic unmasking. It was the slow erosion of a story under cross-examination. Facts do not always fall like dominoes. Sometimes they dissolve by degrees. For Anna, each question that pulled the truth forward felt like a hand reaching into a locked place and turning a key. She listened, hands folded in her lap, the old fear threading through her pulses. When Morrison read aloud the note with her line, the small private joke about idioms that had only she and a few colleagues known, she felt the room tilt toward rightness. David left the deposition looking like a man who had misjudged his own solidity. In public, he tried to frame the day's events as mere legal procedure. In private, his counsel whispered about settlements and damage control. The markets fluttered as the legal fog cleared and then reasserted its rules. It was not a clean victory. Litigation was a long road. But the first deposition had been a hinge, a point where private engineers had been allowed to speak in a forum that mattered. That night, as Anna walked home beneath the halo of streetlights, she fumbled her fingers in her coat pocket and touched the folded business card Marcus had given her. It had the neat personal number, and the ink had smudged a little where her thumb had rested. She felt a small, buoyant thing inside her. Not innocence reclaimed, not a restored throne, but the fact of agency returned. She had not been rescued. She had stepped back into a fight with allies who did not pity her, but believed her. Across town, David made a decision that sharpened the stakes. He moved to compel a protective order, to bury certain logs as privileged, to reframe the inquiry as harassment. He hired a PR firm to reframe the narrative, to paint Anna as a disgruntled former employee who was attempting to cash in on a fleeting narrative. The newspapers took his statement with the same appetite that had once crowned him hero. Public opinion, as it often does, shifted like the wind. Some people cheered David's bravado, others leaned toward the woman who had the scars of a fight etched into small gestures. The internet, always hungry for a tale, fed on both. For Anna, the real work continued with the slow, granular discipline of proving provenance. Metadata could be forged, attacks could be manufactured, but hashes could be traced, and signed commits left a stubborn trail. The team arranged a forensic audit of Lexicona's public release, comparing released outputs to the archival outputs on Anna's USB. A statistical analysis showed patterns. The probability that two independently developed models would produce identical smoothing of idioms was astronomically low. It was not the kind of moment that made a good television clip, but it was the kind the court listened to. Numbers and probabilities printed and stamped by an expert's hand. When Marcus first shared the forensic report with Anna, he did it in a small office late at night. The blinds were down and the city's lights slivered through. He slid the paper across the desk to her with a thumb brushing her knuckle in a brief grounding contact. She read the lines with a feeling like vertigo. Graphs and p-values and confidence intervals all pointing toward the same conclusion. "You did this," Marcus said softly, though he knew she had been the architect. He meant it as recognition, not claim. Anna's fingers gripped the edge of the paper. "We did this," she corrected. It felt important to say it out loud. The pronoun was a map to the future. They were not alone. The team had rallied, the facts had been gathered. She had not returned to a throne, but she had reopened the ledger. In the weeks that followed, pressure mounted in controlled increments. Lexicona's legal team could slow the process with motions and obfuscations, but Marcus's carefully curated public disclosures and the airtight forensic work stripped the sheen off their narrative. David lashed out in small bureaucratic ways, threatening non-disclosure suits, manipulating feeds, but each move left a trace. Each trace tightened the net Marcus and Anna had spent months weaving. Anna slept differently now. The fear still lurked, but it had a companion, a tacit confidence that the world had ears and eyes that could, with enough care, listen to truth. And yet, before the final reveal, there would be another act of theater, smaller, human, and necessary. Marcus invited her to a quiet dinner, not as an ally, but as something between two people learning to keep each other steady. It was the first time since the trial had begun that she closed the apartment door and did not look at the folder under the mattress. She wore a simple dress and a coat that smelled faintly of the citrus cleaner the restaurant used, and Marcus arrived with a book in his hand and an expression that was easier than business. They ate slowly. The city hummed below them. Their conversation turned away from documents and toward small things, favorite foods, the odd lullaby of childhood, the way Marcus's father had taught him to watch for the good in people. When their hands brushed, it was not a claim, but a caution, a veteran handshake between two people learning to trade secrets. He reached across the table at one point and, with a thumb that hesitated the length of a small confession, brushed the scar near her wrist where the hospital band had once been. "You've been careful," he said. "You don't need to hide now." Anna's throat closed on a laugh, and she allowed herself to let that thread of warmth sit in her chest. She had spent too many years making herself small. The danger now was not simply outside, but in losing sight of her capacity to trust. Marcus's presence was an invitation to rebuild a model not of code, but of life. Outside, the city went on. Inside the gentle orbit of the dinner, two people learned to be companions. The fight for the patents continued, but there were minutes of peace threaded through the long work of justice. When the time came to step into the public light and confront David directly, the plan would not hinge on spectacle. It would hinge on evidence, the sanitized record of a code base, the unaltered logs, the patterns that statistical analysis could not deny. The arc of their fight would be procedural, careful, and relentless. But before the courtroom lights and the lawyers' questions, there was a small domestic scene that mattered. A man who had seen a woman stop being invisible, and a woman who had allowed herself to be seen. They agreed, without dramatic vows, to continue together. Anna thought of the television ad. "If you translate this in 10 minutes, you win $1 million. And she thought of the world that had laughed at her. There would be a moment ahead where laughter would stop. There would be a moment where documents would make truth unavoidable. For now, she folded her napkin and let the warmth of the evening settle in her bones. The long work waited, but she did not go to it alone. They returned to the work that had always been the hearth of their alliance. The room with the whiteboard that smelled faintly of marker and coffee, the laptops that glowed like patient sentinels, the stack of printouts that had become a kind of scripture. The team gathered quickly, moving with the quiet choreography of people who had rehearsed for this exact sequence. There were outlines to trim, witness lists to reorder, a chronology to print in an appendix that would make the story of the code unassailable. Anna found, to her own surprise, that the act of speaking the facts aloud steadied her. She read the executive summary while others annotated, her voice even, the sentences landing on the table and staying there. Marcus sat beside her, pen poised but mostly listening, occasionally lifting a finger to mark a place where she might pause for emphasis. He had learned, over months of conferences and negotiations, how to be a partner who corrected without diminishing. "Start with the simplest line," he said when they rehearsed. "What you know, in a sentence. Then let the evidence hold the rest." So she began with a sentence that was almost a refusal to be dramatic. The algorithm annotated in those logs belonged to the team she had led. It was modest and it was true, and it made the room rearrange itself around that small center. Outside, David's moves came in the predictable rhythm of a well-resourced adversary. There were letters from lawyers with sterling letterheads, an internal memo leaked to a trade outlet that framed the case as a breach of contract rather than corporate theft, and a message from someone in Lexicona's communications wing designed to sour public sympathy by implying that the company's patents were at risk if certain documents were released. Each missive aimed to shift attention, to frame the narrative as a technical dispute rather than the systematic, cynical repackaging of someone else's labor. Marcus handled them as he handled everything, by answering without rage. He drafted a letter to the court that was precise as a scalpel, and he and Anna walked it through, line by line. They prepared declarations, lined up timestamps, and arranged for the independent archive to publish the raw logs as soon as the judge allowed it. There was, Marcus warned, the ritual of procedure to be navigated. Motions, depositions, the careful, slow outrun of corporate motion practice. Justice, he said, did not always arrive quickly. Still, it arrived more often when the facts were clean and the witnesses unspoked. There was one evening, late, when the team dispersed and Anna stayed at the table with only a travel mug cooling beside her. She thumbed through an old file, the one that had started it all, an early prototype with her initials scribbled in the margins. Her hand trembled only slightly as she held the page. For years, it had been a thing to hide, to tuck away under her mattress, as though a patent office and a boardroom could be dissuaded by the personal intimacy of paper. Now she set it deliberately on top of the folder marked exits. When Marcus came back with 2 steaming cups, he did not kneel to take it away or to minimize the moment. He sat opposite and matched her steadiness with his own. "You don't have to do the talking alone," he said. It was a simple promise. Inside it carried months of labor and the peculiar gravity of 2 people who had chosen, without grand declarations, to hold the same corner of a fight. Their legal team scheduled a preliminary hearing to determine whether the confidential records could be unsealed and whether an expert's testimony would be allowed. It was a small victory, and a gate. If the judge agreed that the public interest outweighed Lexicona's commercial secrecy, a lot of the company's crafted narrative would be forced into the open. If the judge denied them, the case would be delayed, their victory receding into a longer campaign. Anna slept badly the night before the hearing. She woke several times and found Marcus already awake, reading the lines of the chronology by lamp. They did what they could to inoculate themselves against surprise. Marcus ran a mock cross-examination with one of the junior lawyers playing a prosecutor who said things he would not. That Anna was bitter, that she had left the company for motives of vengeance. Anna answered each invented accusation with the facts they had rehearsed. The practice moved the fear along its axis until it became a tool rather than a tyrant. On the morning of the hearing, they stepped out into a city that felt ordinary. A coffee cart steaming on the corner, a dog tugging at a leash, a bus that hissed to a stop. Those small continuities were like the breath before a plunge. In the courthouse corridor, under fluorescent lights and the hush of people doing their daily civic work, Anna felt the old sensation of being seen and, for the first time in a long while, did not look away. They walked toward the courtroom together. The papers were clean. The evidence was organized. There was, waiting inside, a small audience of colleagues, a few reporters, and the shadow of a corporation that would not stop turning its machines towards self-preservation. Anna felt fear, and beneath it a steadier current, the knowledge that she had not arrived at this doorway by accident, that every careful step had been taken in company. She steadied her shoulders, folded the chronology, and let Marcus take the outer door handle. They entered.